Welcome back to Silicon Wafers, and this is a long episode where we go through what is happening in the so-called peace negotiation process, but we also flag something that may well be coming our way, and that is more leaks, like the original ones that could prove to be incredibly embarrassing for Witkoff, potentially even derail this process, which is not as bad as you may think, because it is, in my view, a fake process. Anyway, before we jump in, thanks to everyone who has supported the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. As you know, it is absolutely instrumental in helping to keep this going. The interviews, the conversations, the recordings in the field. We think this is incredibly important for Ukraine, and we couldn't do it without your assistance. Today, leaks from inside the Trump peace machine, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and the business of peace. Why Vladimir Putin is never going to settle for a real estate deal on Ukraine. The fundamental misalignment between American expectations from the peace process and Russia's ambitions and intent. Why is the media, and indeed many voices in Europe, playing along with this fake peace process, this charade of diplomacy and dialogue? Let's dig into the detail, the leaks we've heard and the ones we haven't yet. In the last week, Bloomberg publishes a transcript of a 5-minute call from October 14th between Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, New York real estate guy, not a diplomat, and Yuri Ushakov, Vladimir Putin's top foreign policy aide. That's from Bloomberg. On that call, Witkoff essentially does two things. He coaches the Kremlin on how to talk to Donald Trump. He nudges them towards a peace plan that looks suspiciously like Russia's long-standing wish list for Ukraine. According to Bloomberg's transcript, Witkoff encourages Ushakov to have Putin flatter Trump over the recent Gaza ceasefire and then use that success as a template for Ukraine. Again, that's from Bloomberg. In the words of an AP write-up, Witkoff advised Ushakov on positioning a Ukraine peace proposal to Trump, including by praising Trump's Gaza deal and suggesting a phone call before Zelensky's White House visit. On the Russian side, there's a second intercepted call between Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev, the Kremlin's investment envoy and longtime back-channel operator in Washington, where they talk openly about feeding their own version of a plan into the Trump system and making it look like an American initiative. That's reported in Reuters. French paper Le Monde summarized the vibe of these conversations very neatly. Witkoff comes across as overly familiar and deferential, verging on the obsequious and servile. At one point saying, "I have the utmost respect for President Putin," and assuring the Russians he has Trump's confidence to shape the deal. That's in Le Monde. Cue a predictable political explosion in Washington. Democrat Ted Lieu calls Witkoff an actual traitor, adding that he is supposed to work for the United States, not Russia. That's in Wikipedia. Republican Don Bacon blasts him for fully favoring the Russians and demands that he be fired. Republican Brian Fitzpatrick warns the episode shows why ridiculous sideshows and secret meetings must stop. Guardian's US coverage calls it out bluntly. America's own envoy appears to be advising a hostile power on negotiating tactics with the US president and floating Ukraine giving up Donetsk and other regions as the price of peace. But all this outrage did not nip this in the bud. It's still going on now as Witkoff heads to Moscow to tout a deal, the conditions of which may be entirely unacceptable to both Ukraine and Russia, as well as being unacceptable to Europe, but they are being cut out of the loop on all of this. More of that later. The Kremlin denounced the leak as unacceptable and a form of hybrid warfare, insisting it's an attempt to sabotage their talks with Trump. That's in Reuters. Putin's aide Ushakov half admits the call is authentic, then calls publishing it, of course, unacceptable, and promises to take it up with Witkoff. But who leaked these calls and why? And what more may be about to drop? Here are a few theories and options, which will require a lot more evidence to corroborate. They are just speculative at this point. The first idea, the Americans leaked the call, either from the administration or from a source within the administration, but intent on working against this policy. There seems little obvious logic for the Trump team to leak these explosive revelations themselves, but clear reasons why the pro-Ukraine faction within the administration may see a benefit in doing so. Then there's the Europeans who are aghast at the transactional approach to this process of Witkoff and Kushner, an approach that is free of any hint of values and morality, and in fact seems to have little basis in long-term strategic thinking. But do the Europeans have the intelligence capabilities to pull off this kind of a hacking, eavesdropping operation? It's been pointed out that the British potentially do have this capability and have motive. But if the source of this information is a technology or agent within the Russian system and able to crack so-called encrypted communications, then this is an asset or approach that is now exposed. That could potentially be a very expensive burning of a very valuable intelligence asset or capability. Is the situation so dire that it qualifies for such a revealing and potentially expensive move by the British? Especially as we see that so far this leak has not derailed the process. The final theory is perhaps the most intriguing, that the Russians themselves leaked this, and there are several clear motivations why they might. To embarrass and destabilize the US negotiating team ahead of the talks to gain some advantage. Potentially the Kremlin does not want to make peace, so it's convenient to set any future breakdown of talks as the fault of the Americans and the leaks themselves. It's framing future justifications for a continuation of aggression, something that Putin likely wants anyway. But there's another idea why this would be beneficial to the Kremlin. Divide and conquer. This move makes sense if we see the peace process as an actual operation designed to divide Ukraine from its allies, divide Europe from the US, and divide the US internally, both the administration and political classes, and as well to inflame the media environment with recriminations. This potentially fits with Russian operations of the past, especially if we believe that the Steele dossier may well have been such a similar operation. And here's where there are hints of new revelations about to land. German MP Roderick Kieswetter, a former intelligence officer, warns that further recordings may also be leaked, suggesting what we've heard is only part of a longer tape saga. Well, that was posted on social media and on other social media platforms. People are already waiting for the box set to be released. One viral post on X reads, "Witkoff looks like a guy who got exposed in front of the whole world. I love this for him. I bet he looks great in an orange suit." And there's certainly more recordings where that came from. That's from X, formerly Twitter. We are in this weird moment where we know at least 2 calls have been intercepted. We know Bloomberg sources had actual audio, and serious political figures in Europe are hinting there is still more that is under wraps. And yet in the middle of that, Steve Witkoff has boarded a plane to Moscow to sit down with Vladimir Putin and possibly Jared Kushner at his side. Well, that was said by The Guardian before we knew the detail. That trip is now in progress. These 2 amateur clowns are now wandering around central Moscow, their ears being filled by lies by Kirill Dmitriev, which brings us to the obvious question in all of this. Why are Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in this room at all? Let's be very clear about who we're talking about. Steve Witkoff is a New York property developer, not a career diplomat, not a regional expert, a man who, as El Pace dryly notes, once used to buy Trump sandwiches and now is negotiating war and peace in Europe. His resume in international conflict is essentially boosting Trump financially and socially over decades, then helping sell a Gaza ceasefire deal that Trump now touts as proof his team can solve intractable conflicts if you just let the businessmen loose. But the so-called peace deal in Gaza seems to be breaking down mere days after it was signed. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations. Jared Kushner, meanwhile, is the man who bought you the deal of the century in the Middle East, a plan marketed as peace to prosperity that critics across the region said looked more like a real estate brochure for Israeli annexation. Well, that's the way the Middle East Eye put it. Fast forward to Ukraine and you see the same pattern. Axios and Al Jazeera both report that this new 28-point Ukraine plan was developed by Kushner and Witkoff after meetings with Kirill Dmitriev on the Russian side and allegedly Rustam Umerov on the Ukrainian side, although I suspect his input was minimal, before being carried to Trump for the green light. That's in Al Jazeera. Reuters and Sky News add that the document itself appears to be heavily based on a paper originally written by Dmitriev. In other words, a Russian authored template that then gets laundered into a US plan. That's from Reuters. The European Council on Foreign Relations drives the point home. The reported architects of the plan, Witkoff and Dmitriev, are real estate investors and strangers to international law and norms. This is Trump diplomacy in pure form, loyalty over expertise, deals over principles, and an instinctive belief that everything, including sovereignty and borders, is up for negotiation if the price is right. Well, this is not far from Putin's own belief that anything and anyone can be bought. You just have to find the right price. Next, the business of peace, Trump's transactional model. Trump has never pretended to do values-based foreign policy. His brand is the deal. Axios' scoop on the 28-point plan notes that it's literally inspired by President Trump's successful push for a deal in Gaza. The idea being that if you can impose a ceasefire there by throwing money and pressure around, you can do the same in Ukraine. Again, that's from the European Council on Foreign Relations, but the scenario is a bit different this time round, and Ukraine has a different set of cards in its hand. Here's the logic that shows up in the Ukraine plan and the leaks as well. One, first you freeze the conflict roughly at the current front line, recognizing Russian control over Crimea and large chunks of Donbass and Luhansk, possibly along with gains in Zaporizhia and Kherson. This is, it must be pointed out, unconstitutional, illegal, and impossible from the Ukrainian perspective. Two, Ukraine agrees never to join NATO, slashes the size of its army, and accepts demilitarized zones on its territory. That's from The Guardian. Point three, Russia in return gets a pathway back to the global economy, sanctions relief, talk of readmission to formats like the G8, the promise of Western businesses returning. That's from The Guardian. But can we really see European countries once more sitting down at any international conference with Putin present? It is practically inconceivable. Four, reconstruction money flows in, with the US and allies taking a commission on frozen assets and future investment. That's from the Washington Post. So is this a brokerage fee or is it extortion? You decide. The Washington Post describes the plan as realpolitik on steroids, full of classic hard sell tactics, deadlines, threats to cut off aid, and pressure on a weakened Ukraine to sign before its bargaining position erodes further. Of course, there is the inherent position here that the US side is underestimating the strength and position of Ukraine at the present time. Human Rights Watch's former head, Kenneth Roth, put it more bluntly in The Guardian. Trump is treating Ukraine like a mere territorial dispute, as if you can hand Putin a chunk of land and he'll go home satisfied, and not the large-scale imperial genocidal war that it clearly is. That's in The Guardian. And in a biting line circulating in op-eds and social media, Garry Kasparov captures the whole thing as a real estate transaction presented as a peace plan. That's on Facebook. Which brings us to Putin, why he isn't a buyer in this real estate deal. Western commentators keep making the same mistake, assuming Putin is a rational and well-intentioned negotiator that seeks the same transactional outcomes as the US is proposing. The evidence says otherwise. Start with Putin's own words in his 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He argues that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Ukraine's borders are an historical accident, and that an ethnically pure Ukrainian state aggressive towards Russia is like a weapon of mass destruction. But of course, the Ukrainian state has only ever wanted just to conduct its own business. It's never shown any interest whatsoever in invading Russia, annexing its territory, or even taking back territories that once were populated by ethnic Ukrainians, including Belgorod, Kursk, and Rostov-on-Don. The Atlantic Council notes that this essay is essentially a manifesto for empire. True sovereignty of Ukraine, Putin claims, is only possible in partnership with Russia, which in practice has meant subjugation. That's according, as I say, to Atlantic Council. Since then, nothing in Putin's behaviour suggests a man looking for a neat off-ramp. In his February 21st, 2022 speech on the eve of the full-scale invasion, Putin declared that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, dismissing its statehood as artificial. Russian state media has run pieces openly titled "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," talking about denazification and re-education. These are thinly veiled calls for the erasure of Ukrainian identity. Many of the regime propagandists are far more explicit, and they are explicit on a regular, dare I say it, even daily basis on this theme about how Ukraine should be erased. Peter Dickinson at the Atlantic Council sums it up. For Putin, the war is an historic mission to reverse the Soviet collapse and revive the Russian Empire, and he is perfectly happy to entertain the idea of negotiations in order to buy time, but has no intention of stopping until Ukrainian statehood has been extinguished. In other words, peace talks are a tactic, not a goal. That's exactly how Russia is playing the current process. Reuters reports a senior Russian diplomat flatly ruling out big concessions even after the Witkoff leak, while Moscow's line remains recognition of territorial gains, Ukrainian neutrality, and limits on its armed forces, that is, weakening Ukraine ahead of Russia's next push to conquer it completely. Well, part of that was taken from Reuters. From the Kremlin's perspective, Trump's 28-point draft, with its recognition of Crimea and Donbass, NATO veto, and army caps, isn't a compromise. It's simply step one. If they can get those fundamentals locked in, they can come back for the rest later. This is also assuming that the version that goes to Putin will be the final version. No, he will demand more and more and more throughout this process. That is guaranteed. But we also have a fundamental problem here. Two pieces, one war, why these models for how to resolve it do not match. These are competing sets of logic divided by a chasm of mutual incomprehension. The Trump-Witkoff-Kushner view of peace is that the war is a costly, stupid mess, primarily that it is a hindrance to conducting business, to making money, to banking profits. This logic suggests that if you freeze the lines of conflict, you give each side something to claim as a victory and can open up the taps for trade. Everyone moves on and enriches themselves. There is a certain gangster economic logic in this worldview. There is some rationality to it, even if there is no morality. Putin's view of peace is quite different. The war is a civilizational project, erasing an anti-Russia on his border, rewriting history, and demonstrating to the world that Western guarantees mean nothing. This is collated from Wikipedia. Any peace that leaves Ukrainian independence intact, armed, and oriented towards Europe is at best, in Putin's mind, a temporary ceasefire, not a success. Negotiations are useful primarily to sap Western unity, pause fighting to allow Russia to regroup, and lock in victories that he has already won. That is from the Atlantic Council. In Putin's worldview, any material benefits of a minerals deal or reconstruction project have no real meaning compared to the historical role he imagines of himself, of reconstituting the Russian imperial project or uniting former territories of the empire, and even of destroying the international order that has been in place since 1945, as exemplified by the EU and NATO. To an extent, this also includes the UN, removing its global credibility and eroding its effectiveness. You can immediately see the clash. European leaders are not stupid. They see this divergence very clearly. The problem is action in concert to stop and overturn the fake transactional peace roadshow that is unfolding. And of course, they fear Trump. Of course, they do. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warns against any carving up of a sovereign European nation, stressing that you cannot make peace by legitimizing territorial conquest. That's from The Guardian. Estonia's Kaja Kallas, now EU foreign policy chief, says outright that Putin is seeking through negotiations what he cannot achieve on the battlefield, and that a deal rewarding aggression would endanger all of Europe. Again, from The Guardian. From Kiev, the message is even blunter. Ukrainian officials and media described the original 28-point US peace plan as a Russian wish list, with red lines including territorial concessions, NATO vetoes, and forced demilitarization. That's a summary from Al Jazeera. President Zelensky, currently shuttling between European capitals, keeps repeating variants of the same line. Ukraine will not accept a peace that rewards Russia for invasion and leaves the door open to a future attack. Even inside the US, criticism is loud. Mitch McConnell calls the plan a reward for Russian butchery and a disaster for American interests. That's from the Kiev Independent. Analysts at CSIS warn the text is so full of loose ends and unrealistic assumptions that it is impossible to implement, and crucially that it reflects Manhattan real estate tactics more than serious peacemaking or diplomacy. One commentator in the Atlantic Council put it like this: Trump sees the war as a geopolitical real estate deal, while Putin thinks he's rewriting the map of Europe for a century. And then there's Russian propaganda. Russian officials slam the Witkoff leak as hybrid warfare by the West, but they are also clearly delighted by the content of it. US envoys talking about freezing lines and recognizing Russian gains. Dmitriev even markets Trump's plan on X to save Ukraine from losing more land and lives. And it is entirely disingenuous, framing territorial surrender as humanitarian. That's from Reuters. To our point above, if we ask who benefits most from the leaks, despite the performative denials, then it is the Russians rather than the Americans. On Russian television and Telegram, pro-Kremlin pundits gloat that the Americans are finally becoming realistic, while simultaneously insisting that Russia will not retreat from any of its maximalist aims. That's in Le Monde. So what do the Witkoff leaks really tell us? When you strip back the drama and media noise, the Witkoff recordings tell us three things. First, that the Trump administration's peace team is not just talking to the Kremlin, it is absorbing and channeling Russian preferences into US policy proposals. Reuters reports that the 28-point plan literally drew from a Russian-authored document submitted in October. Axios confirms that some of the most controversial provisions match long-standing Kremlin demands. Add to that today's news that Kushner and Witkoff are skipping a meeting with Zelensky in Europe and flying straight back to the US to report Putin's messages directly to Trump, suggests that not only is the US seeking to cut Europe out of the negotiation and deal, but Ukraine also. But for the more cynical amongst us, it's clear that this was a preferred game plan by Trump and Putin from the very start. Second, that the style of engagement is dangerously deferential. Witkoff telling Russian officials he has utmost respect for Putin and coaching them on how to handle Trump is not clever negotiation. It's an envoy signalling which side he instinctively and demonstratively identifies with. Again, Le Monde. Third, that there is likely more beneath the surface when serious figures like Kisvetter warn of additional recordings. The US intelligence veterans tell The Guardian and Newsweek they suspect an insider leak. It suggests a broader discomfort inside the system with how these talks are being run. Again, reported by The Guardian. From an activist perspective, the question is simple. Are we watching a serious attempt to build a just peace anchored in international law and Ukrainian sovereignty? The answer is no. At best, this is a poorly aligned piece of transactional deal-making executed by badly informed amateurs on the US side. At worst, it's collusion to sell out Ukraine and weaken it, perhaps in the deluded belief that such a solution will hold over the long term. But perhaps they don't care, as it only needs to hold for long enough for them to extract a profit from the situation. But the very tone, structure, and approach of the US side is wrong. It simply does not align with what the victim needs or the aggressor wants. This is not a fractious meeting of a geriatric condo board in Florida, but a set of decisions that will affect millions of living people and potentially deny justice to hundreds of thousands of murdered ones. Donetsk is not a sweetener, and it's not appropriate to leverage a peace brokerage fee onto the agreement. The lives of people in Kharkiv and Odessa are not bargaining chips to be moved around a spreadsheet or scribbled down on the back of a napkin in Moscow, Miami, or Mar-a-Lago. Putin has told us in speeches, essays, and in bombs what he wants: a broken, subordinate Ukraine, a basket case, and a frightened Europe. And for what? So that he can attack again and on a far greater scale. Trump's peace team is telling us what they want: a fast win, a photo opportunity, and a deal they can sell as proof that businessmen can fix geopolitics better than the politicians, and maybe a gold Nobel gong at the end of it. The one thing made of gold that Trump cannot buy with his ill-gotten gains. Those two agendas are not compatible. Ukraine is not for sale, and any plan that treats it as a distressed asset, whether drawn up in Moscow or in a Florida resort or in a Bloomberg transcript, is not a peace plan. Let's hope that the next audio leak destroys completely and utterly the reputations of these cynical grifters and forces Europe to face the terrifying reality of the situation.